All right, so this video I'm calling the women question. And this is actually the phrase that Victorians themselves used to describe what they thought of as a problem. What to do about women, what women were for, what women should and shouldn't be allowed. And before we go anywhere, I want to set the stance for this video. So we're not going to talk about whether the Victorians were sexist. Of course they were. We don't need 10 minutes for that. What we need 10 minutes for is something more interesting and more useful for your reading. It's how the anxiety about women's roles shaped the stories they told. If you can see how the system was working, like what it was doing, what it was protecting against, you're going to read your novel in a different way than someone reading it just through a 21st century lens. So that's our job today. Let's go. Okay, so let's start somewhere concrete. Until 1882, which was well within the Victorian period, a married woman in England couldn't own property in her own name. So if she came into a marriage with assets, those assets became her husband. If she inherited something during the marriage, that inheritance became her husband's. She could not keep the wages she earned if she worked outside the home, and many working class women did. They worked in factories and service as seamstresses. Every shing every shilling she earned belonged to her husband's legally, and she could not leave a marriage in any normal way. So divorce existed, but it was vanishingly rare. It was very expensive and almost always granted to men, not women. For most women, marriage was a one-way door. So that's not an attitude, that's the law, that's the legal default, which meant marriage in Victorian England wasn't a partnership. It was a transfer of legal personhood from her father's name to her husband's, from one set of restrictions to another. I know this is not new to you. You've learned about this in history, but the woman herself didn't have any independent legal existence inside marriage. So she was under English common law covered by her husband's. The legal term for it was coverture. I just want you to hold that because in your novels, when you're reading about marriage proposals and dowries and refusing to match, eloping, returning to a father's house, every one of those plot points is operating against this legal backdrop. And that's the bedrock. Now, let's look at the culture built on top. The cultural ideal that organized everything else was a doctrine called separate spheres. So, two worlds, one for men and one for women. And there was almost no overlap. The public sphere was for men: work, politics, money, knowledge, the world. Men went out into it, they dealt with it, and they came home from it. And then the private sphere was for women. That was the home, the children, morality, beauty, the interior life. So women stayed inside it, were made for it, and were expected to never want anything else. And the line between them was supposed to be sacred and impermeable. A woman who tried to enter the public sphere, like to work for a serious wage, to vote, to study at a university, to publish a book under her own name, was not doing something unusual. She was actually violating the doctrine itself. So it's not really inconvenient. It's actually something that could destabilize the whole society. The cultural picture of what a woman was supposed to be had a name: The Angel in the House. And it came from a poem. The poem described a wife as the moral center of the home: selfless, pure, patient, devoted. The phrase took off because it captured something the culture wanted to be. The Victorian woman in the ideal was selfless, always thinking of others first, pure, no desire of her own, patient, suffering without complaint, domestic. Her power was over the home and only the home. If you match the picture, you were good. You were celebrated. You were the moral compass of the family. But if you didn't match, if you wanted things, if you spoke up, if you got tired, if you got angry, something was wrong with you, not with the picture. Now, here's the part I think is pretty important because I think this is the analytical lift of the whole video. Now, here's the part I really want you to hold on to. The anxiety in Victorian culture wasn't really about women gaining rights. It was about what would happen to the social order itself. If women stopped performing the role they'd been assigned, what would happen? If women stopped working, who keeps the home? If women stopped being the moral center, what happens to the family? If women had their own desires, what happens to marriage as a transfer of property and bloodlines? And if women voted, what happens to a political system that assumes they wouldn't? So the system was built on women playing a specific part. And if you take women out of the part, the whole structure, economic, political, social, religious, has to rearrange. That's why even small acts of female autonomy felt to many Victorians huge, disproportionately threatening, existentially threatening. So it wasn't really about her, it was about everything she was holding up and represented. Okay, so the system held, but not without leaks, right? Let's look at the cracks. By the late 19th century, right around when Dracula was published, in fact, there was a figure in British culture called the New Woman. So there wasn't really an organization here, it was more like a type. The women who wanted education, like real education, university, when universities barely accepted women, they wanted work, like real work. They wanted a profession. They wanted a salary that was theirs. They wanted some form of autonomy in her own life. Um, the right to refuse a marriage, the right to ride a bicycle in public, the right to study, to publish, to decide. So that doesn't sound radical to us, but it was treated as radical at the time. The culture's response to the new woman was anxiety. There was mockery in the magazines, backlash from politicians, articles warning that if women got educated, their reproductive systems would shut down. There were articles warning that the new woman would destroy marriage, destroy the family, and really destroy civilization itself. It wasn't just a we disagree with this, they thought civilization will end. That's the temperature here, and that's how seriously the culture was taking the question. And here's the single fact that captures how deep this went. When *The Wuthering Heights* was published in 1847, it was credited to Ellis Bell. It's a man's name. All three Bronte sisters published under male pseudonyms: Currer, Ellis, Acton, Bell. They picked names that were gender ambiguous enough to skirt the issue, but masculine enough to be taken seriously. They weren't trying to be clever, but it was really so that they could be taken seriously at all. And if you take a look at the history of Wuthering Heights, it's pretty interesting because they thought that it was very um, vulgar, and they easily attributed it to a man. So just a little digression there. But eventually the truth came out. Charlotte Bronte's identity was revealed, that she'd written Jane Eyre, one of the most important novels of the century. And the reviews after the unmasking called Charlotte's work unfeminine in its passion. A novel that was praised when readers thought it had been written by a man became unfeminine the moment they learned a woman wrote it. It was the same words, obviously, that had a different reception. And so that just shows that the disguise that the sisters put on wasn't paranoia, it was actually really necessary. Now, to the novels. Is each one is a battleground for the question. What is a woman for in this world, and what happens when she refuses the role? So what's important here is that each one has a different answer, and some actually have no answer at all. Let's look at how differently each author is asking the question. We have Wuthering Heights. Catherine Earnshaw is offered a choice. She has desire or social survival. She loves Heathcliff and famously says it would degrade her to marry him. So she chooses social survival and marries Edgar Lytton. The novel doesn't reward that choice. It also doesn't reward the alternative. So it puts Catherine in this impossible position and refuses to give her, or us really, a clean answer. With A Tale of Two Cities, we have multiple women with power. We have Lucy Manette, the angel in the house. We have Lucy Manette, the angel in the house. She is selfless, devoted. She's holding her family together. Does she get that happy ending? We'll see. And then we have Madame Defarge. She is strategic and she has this terrifying mind. And she actually, I don't want to like give too much away, but she has arguably the most legitimate grievance in the book, and we see what happens with her. Um, but we see how Dickens treats female power. And he, in this novel, is showing what kinds of power the novel can celebrate and what kinds it has to destroy. So he doesn't apologize for that difference. And then in Dracula, we have Mina Harker. And Mina is so interesting because she's competent. She is the team's information organizer. and she compiles everyone's documents. She actually types the novel into existence. She's brilliant. And the men in the middle of the crisis, well, we'll get to it. I don't want to give any spoilers here either, but they have to protect her in very specific ways that go against this role that she's playing. And just pay attention to what that withholding of evidence actually means for her and her safety.